Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by the American Hospital Communication Act, which simply states, don't communicate, ever. Episode 271, React Native from a Flutter dev's perspective. This is going to be good.
Did you watch the coronation of King Charles, Robin? Was that on your list of things to do? Did you wake up early?
No, I did not get up at 2:30 in the morning to watch the king get a fancy hat.
Is that all it is? That he just gets the fancy hat?
I mean, obviously it's very significant and serious, religious and important ceremony. In
Cultural.
The British, yes, cultural ceremony. But, I mean, when it comes down to the coronation, it's literally guy gets fancy hat.
Guy gets fancy hat. I saw that fancy hat. I think I did anyway. I went and saw the crown jewels.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the things that you can do when you go to London. It's like a
Tower of London
thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I think he really only
cool.
wears it like the one time and not really ever again, except for maybe really special occasions. I don't know.
You know, it's interesting to me because obviously as an American, we founded this country because we didn't really like the king.
Well, it's
I say
kind of
we
come
as if
full
I had anything
circle
to do
now,
with
and
it.
now like I feel like Americans are kind of like obsessed with the royal family now, which
I know,
is
right?
ironic. Considering.
How does that work? All of a
I don't
sudden
know.
now it's probably more popular here in some ways.
So no, I didn't watch it. I have caught up on the highlights on social media, the fashion.
Right. It's a cultural event. You know, I enjoy history, and I do like the fact that this is a ceremony that has gone back a long time. I mean, I don't know when the first one was, but it was a very long time ago, and they continue to do it to this day.
I know, it's kind of impressive how long they've been able to keep this going.
Right. Traditions, actually, there's something cool about some of those
It
things.
is. And you're like, you look at like about what's happening and you're like, that chair, the throne that he's sitting in is like 600 years old. It's actually pretty cool.
We don't have history like that around us.
No, our history kind of starts 300 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm like, wow, that 7-Eleven wasn't there 20 years ago. That's type of American history. But our guest actually comes from a part of the country where there's a little more history. I'm going to introduce him in a second. But I am Jamon Holmgren, your host, friendly CTO of Infinite Red. I live in the beautiful, but, there's some history in the Pacific Northwest. It goes back to obviously there's the Native American history that's in this area, and there's some other cool stuff. But I live here with my wife and 4 kids. I am joined today by and I love this adjective that I chose without thinking about it, majestic co-host, Robin, and a guest who I will introduce, like I said, in a minute. Also, by the way, Mazen, a little bit of royalty as well. He's getting a crown today, so I think he's
he's getting a dental crown, and he's been telling people that today is his coronation. It's hilarious.
Yeah, and given that he grew up in Nigeria, I don't know if I believe him. You know, another Nigerian royalty.
Prince.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe him.
Well, I hope he's not in any pain right now.
Robin is a senior software engineer at Infinite Red, located west of Portland, Oregon. Not too far from me. Something like 35-minute drive, something
It's
like
like
that.
a
I've actually
drive.
driven out there, but not to meet you. It was to play hockey.
I see how it is.
Well, it's not like you've come my way either. With her husband and 2 kids, and is specialized in React Native for the past probably close to 6 years now. And our guest today is not a React Native developer. However, I think I'm really excited about this. Luke Pighetti. Luke, welcome to the podcast. Described as a self-starter, strong finisher with a diverse background, spanning all kinds of stuff, including consumer software development, physical product design. You actually talked about a product that you designed, some headphones or something like that recently.
Yeah, that goes way back. Well, I see you're like creeping on my LinkedIn, pulling stuff that I wrote 4 years ago.
No, you were responding to someone else saying, I designed part of these headphones. It was on Twitter. But yeah, I should go check out your LinkedIn as well.
Also, I just noticed that we're water bottle buddies.
Oh, yeah. These are the greatest of all
Pretty sure,
time.
is it
And we
actually
have
the
exact same color and
That's
everything.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Literally water bottle twins.
So obviously people can't see it. Describe what's going on here, Robin.
We both have the Stanley what is it? The Quencher?
Adventure Quencher.
The Quencher, yeah.
It's the, what is it? The 40-ounce Stanley Adventure
So I'm
Quencher?
pretty sure mine is the 30 ounce, so it's not quite as...
I think mine's the same as yours. I think I just like to call it my 40.
Luke,
I have a
40
Camelback.
hands. There you go. That's
A
classic.
shoot. Yeah.
It's classic.
Yeah, it is.
Vintage.
48 ounce vintage. It gets water into me. So Luke, you are a staff mobile engineer at Tonal. Is that correct? Looks like it's correct.
Yeah, you have been creeping my LinkedIn. So yeah, no, I'm a staff software engineer at Tonal. I work there doing Flutter engineering. But I consider myself, I like to call myself a multimodal software technician. Mm-hmm. So I'm a Flutter engineer, but I do all kinds of other things at, let's call it the technician's level. Yeah. And I just love working in software. I live in Maine, so I'm about as far away from Jamon as I can possibly get, but still be in the United States.
I was like, I don't know, is Florida further?
Right probably, but
it could be. Well, actually, that's a good question.
I'm actually curious now, but
I know that the flight from Boston to San Francisco is farther than the flight from Miami to
just ask
San Francisco. I believe that's true.
Wow.
But we'll have to double check it. But yeah, no, I live near beautiful Acadia National Park, which we like to get to every now and then. That's usually the easiest way to describe to people where I am, because a lot of people, at least in the East Coast, know where that is. But yeah, no, I think Jamon, you and I first got introduced kind of by way of Theo, actually.
Yeah, so Theo, the streamer and YouTuber, popular on YouTube and streaming on Twitter and whatnot. I was writing a Flutter versus React Native article, which I provocatively titled "Flutter is better than React Native in all the ways that don't matter." And you came in and gave a really fantastic review of it before I published it. Gave me some good responses. You know what was really interesting about that? I really gained two things, main things out of writing that article. One was a deeper appreciation of what Flutter brings to the table. I actually was really impressed. And secondly, really got to know you and what you're all about. And you're a cool guy. It's been cool to be connected since that time. Before we get into the topic, though, I want to mention this episode is sponsored by Infinite Red, my company. It is a premier React Native design and development agency located fully remote in the US and Canada. And if you're looking for React Native expertise, hit us up at infinite.red/React Native. And don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. If you go to infinite.red/Flutter, you're going to find a 404 page. So have fun.
We should put up a page, though, that's a joke.
As a joke?
We should.
Just crashes your browser. All right. So our topic, why do we have Luke on a React Native podcast? Well, we wanted to look at React Native through the eyes of a Flutter developer, and it's not just sort of a random developer. I think Luke has a particular approach here. For one thing, obviously, like you said, Luke, you do all kinds of different technologies. It's not just Flutter. And also, you did a really fun kind of competition with Theo. It was called Flutter versus React Native Live Code Battle. First off, I want to talk really quickly about that. I do want to mention that this isn't necessarily a Flutter episode. We did have 2 other episodes, I think, about Flutter on this, but obviously we'll be talking about Flutter to some degree. But talk about this Flutter versus React Native live code battle that you did with Theo. I want you to set the stage a bit on that.
Yeah, so going back, there were 2 things that happened here. One of them was Jamon writing the article that we referenced, where I gave some feedback. And then Theo also did a rant, which he's very famous for, about Flutter. And in the rant and also in the article, all respect to both of you, there were a lot of factual errors. And so I went ahead and took it upon myself to kind of correct those with Theo specifically. And I did that in kind of a long video response. And Theo actually really appreciated the response. That's what it felt like to me. And so we started talking a little bit, and we came up with an idea that we should do a Flutter versus React Native live code battle just for fun. I had never really done anything like that, but I figured, what the hell, I don't mind sticking my neck out and trying something new. So we decided to do that. But because I like to put a twist on things, I said I'm only going to do it if Theo uses Flutter and I use React Native. So that was was the stipulation on my part. So clearly you can tell that I'm not worried about failing in front of 150 people I don't know on stream. So that was a lot of fun. It worked out pretty well. My takeaway is that, first of all, Theo is a very talented and skilled engineer. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
And that he was able to build something that actually worked pretty well in Flutter, which is using Dart, which is a language that is it's easy to pick up for someone who's been around C-style languages like JavaScript, TypeScript, C#, Java, and stuff like that. But it still has a lot of, like any new language, it has a lot of tools and ways of doing things. Just where to find things, like different methods on different types and stuff like that. And he was able to get through that. But one thing that I also found interesting was that for both him and me, Twitch chat was very helpful. It was almost like in the same way that now you can use GPT-4 to kind of answer questions as they come up. Twitch chat kind of answers questions as they come up without you having to prompt it. And so that was kind of an interesting aspect of the whole challenge, where whenever Theo would run into an issue, there would be a Flutter engineer in his chat who would unblock him. And then whenever I ran into an issue, there was a React Native engineer in my chat who would unblock me. And so I think that helped a lot. And so the community definitely was very involved in the success of both of our engineering spikes, let's call them.
That's really cool. It's like an AI that's watching what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that code battle, I watched it and I was really impressed. Obviously Theo, he's super talented, and I think most people know that if they follow him to any degree. He's polarizing. He's a little polarizing just because he has very strong opinions, but I was really impressed with the sort of your demeanor during the whole thing. You were very kind of open-minded. You were open-minded about my article as well, and like a lot of the feedback you gave me, I incorporated right back into the article. And just to recap really quickly, my argument wasn't that Flutter was worse than React Native. It actually is better in a lot of cases. It was just more that basically the ecosystem matters a lot, and also the business case matters a lot.
Right there in the title, Flutter is better than React. Just cut off the end of it. Just take the first half of the title, and then
the opinion that those things don't matter is, of course, my opinion.
I mean, ecosystem is huge, right? Like that's probably the biggest thing.
Right.
I remember because there's this whole thing in the world of Flutter where everyone who writes Flutter is a Dart engineer. Everyone who writes Dart wants it to take over the world, right? That's just, everybody wants their own tech stack to take over the world. And so what you end up with is there's kind of this Dart bubble on the internet where if you're trying to build a backend, they're like, oh, use this thing called Dart Frog to build your backend. And it's like, okay, Dart Frog is cool technology, but like you have to be insane to actually pick it for your average production backend because the ecosystem isn't there to support it.
Yep.
Meanwhile, someone like me, I like Dart as a language. I think Dart is a really good language. And I think that the tooling that it comes with is very good. And I think that Python is a terrible language. I think that the language server for Python is terrible. I think the dependency management system is terrible. I think that the fact that it had dynamic typing up until recently and the type hints are really flaky and very shallow, I think that's all terrible. There's a lot of things that I really hate about Python, but it's an incredibly high leverage language because of the ecosystem. And so Python, it's literally just like import this thing. Okay, now you've got like this crazy AI model running that can do basically anything you can dream of. And you don't even have to really understand what's going on. So ecosystem is huge, and it's definitely really important.
So when you were doing the code battle, you were using React Native to build this thing. Did you have any experience with React Native before that? And then also, what were your impressions? Like, what did you think of React Native once you started using it as a Flutter developer?
So I have used React Native in the past. It was many years prior, and it was for a contract that I was doing. And so what I would say is that I was familiar with kind of the basics of React and React Native, but the last time I had used it was when everything was class-based components. And Flutter is almost identical to React with class-based components. So I kind of had to move into using hooks at the same time as jumping back into an old framework and an old language.
Which is not an easy
and of course,
transition.
JSX is like, yeah, I mean, it's all right. I mean, JSX is also like another thing you have to learn. So when you're jumping for me, jumping to React Native, it was remembering how to do JSX, remembering, how to, when you're putting in values and when you're putting in objects and properties and stuff like that into your JSX, and just all kinds of little quirks of JSX. I had to kind of remember how to do that. But luckily I didn't have to like set up like a full app. I didn't have to set up like a test runner. I didn't have to set up like all that stuff. That would have made a huge difference, I think.
Yeah, I find that like the setup often is sort of the big blocker for a lot of technologies. And I want, like, obviously like Expo, for example, really streamlines that. Like, you don't even have to have Android Studio and Xcode installed to run Expo. Like, you can even do it on a Windows machine. But React Native has historically, and this is actually one of the biggest complaints I have about it, has historically had a very difficult like environment setup. It takes a long time, and there's a lot of weird little gotchas.
Yeah, you have to like dig into the depths of Android Studio and like uncheck the correct version of like the SDK build tools. And yeah, it's very finicky.
And then God help you if you ever eject your app.
Exactly. And that's what we're like, if you're talking about, if you spin it up with React Native init instead of Expo at all,
you're on your own, bucko.
You're on your own. Yeah, you have to have all of the other things. And that's actually been one of my biggest complaints. It's gotten better over the years, and certainly we've gotten better at it.
That's why we created Ignite. Like,
it's true.
I think this is one of the areas where Flutter really shines. And I don't look at it as like Flutter is better than X. I look at it as, React Native could learn from Y. Yeah. Right. So I don't know what the technical reason is for the ejection system in React Native. But in Flutter, when you add, first of all, in Flutter, there's no concept of an ejected or not ejected app. And all of the native dependencies are very easy to understand. And we have a package system for consuming these native dependencies that is very easy to understand. And whenever I look at an ejected React Native app, I just don't understand why the level of complexity is there. It just seems like something that's very easily avoidable.
So the way that works is when you're talking about ejecting, you're usually talking about when someone's starting with Expo. So Expo being, generally speaking, you have like a pre-configured native side of things that's already very much kind of like a black box. And that's Expo's, Expo Go.
Expo Go, yeah. It's
or
there.
Dev Client is really what it's called, is a Dev Client. And then you have your JavaScript on top of it. And so in some ways it kind of turns it into, this is just a browser, more or less. It's like a custom browser, not using a web view.
Here's an app that runs on your computer like a browser does, and it runs a JavaScript bundle.
Exactly. Now, when you eject, what you're doing with Expo is you're sort of going back to what we call vanilla.
Right.
React
An
Native.
ejected Expo app is equivalent to a plain React Native app that you would just like run React Native in it.
So that's what we did in the beginning. We didn't even use Expo at all. We would just start there. We would start with vanilla.
We didn't have
React
Expo.
Native.
Like when we first started doing React Native, like Expo didn't exist or barely existed.
And the problems it solved weren't problems we were having. So to go back to your thought there, Luke, like why is it so complex? It's because of what Meta's problems, what Facebook's problems were at the time. They wanted to build a view rendering engine, basically native view rendering engine that could be controlled by JavaScript, but implemented into like brownfield into an existing iOS and Android app. So they built it for that. Like, hey, we'll just drop it in to our existing app and replace certain features using this technology. They weren't thinking we're going to build a whole app with this. Like that wasn't like their initial start. So eventually then they're like, well, you got to be able to start a brand new app with this. So then that became sort of the secondary kind of concern there.
Crazy that like the greenfield was the secondary concern.
Exactly.
And now it's like what we do and what most people do with React Native.
It is. And like I usually tell people, if you're going to do greenfield, you should go Expo. Like Expo is designed from the very beginning to be greenfield. They also have a new cool thing called custom dev clients, which you can talk about, which allows you to not eject, but still do custom native code. But that's a whole nother thing.
I wanted to touch on that too, actually, when we have a chance.
Yeah, let's just roll with that.
Okay. So as I understand it, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, in Expo, if you want to modify native code, you're basically creating templates that are then applied during the build step.
Yeah.
That's right.
They're like source code templates.
They call them plugins.
So I don't understand this at all. Like we literally just have native, like normal native iOS and Android plugins that just use the normal native iOS and Android plugin system, and we just consume them. So I have a hard time understanding why you have this situation where you're like doing templated source code applications in native. Like I would really not want to go anywhere near that in a production app.
Let me ask you first, how does Flutter connect to those native modules? Like how do you use that in Dart then?
Yeah, so it's all done through, we call them like platform channels, which you can think of as basically like a pub sub system.
Yeah.
Like the bridge, right?
I don't know what the difference is. Like I know you guys we don't talk about bridges.
Yeah.
I know that React Native talks about bridges. I don't know exactly what the bridge architecture is on React Native.
And Dart is actually compiled into native code, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, they don't need a bridge. They can just call directly over. So I think this is a consequence of running JavaScript in the final app. So you're bundling up JavaScript and shipping it, or in the case of Hermes, you're bundling up Hermes bytecode. But it's essentially still, run it. It's runtime code. It's not compiled in. So essentially, it's a consequence of the bridge. You have to basically expose the native code to JavaScript using some code, and that means that like if we want to use native plugins, which we can use CocoaPods and Gradle plugins and whatnot, then we have to write a little bit of glue code basically to expose it to the JavaScript side, and that's what those plugins are doing. They're essentially adding the glue code that you need in order to use them. Otherwise, you can use them.
So the templates, the like source code templates that are applied, that's just the glue part. It's not like the entire package.
Yeah,
Right.
no, it's not the whole package. It's just
Okay.
Yeah. So we can use any Objective-C, Swift, Kotlin, or Java
right.
module that's exposed by CocoaPods or
It's
or
usually just
Gradle.
a couple of lines of config that tells it how to get the right Gradle package.
With that
or
said,
CocoaPod.
let's say that you want to build your own completely custom native module and you don't want to publish it to CocoaPods. You just want it to be in your thing. You can use a config plugin to also apply those native changes. And the reason you would do that is because of upgrades, mainly. Upgrades are painful if you have custom code in your iOS and Android folders. So by having the config plugins, you can just delete your iOS and Android folders, regenerate them with the latest React Native stuff, and then apply those config plugins over the top. So it's sort of like patch package, if you've used that in the JavaScript world, where you can take a package that you're bringing in from NPM and apply changes to it. And then if you get a new version, you don't have to go in and like tease out the changes you made and add them to the new version. You can just delete your node modules, yarn install, and apply your package customizations over the top. It's pretty similar to that.
So what's interesting is in Flutter, because Flutter is basically just a 2D texture, like a 2D surface that's being painted, the actual integration with the native platform is like 50 lines of code, essentially, at least the part that's exposed to us. And then from there, you have these platform channels, which I described earlier as kind of like a pub subsystem, like a messaging system. And because of that, I think that's why it's so decoupled from that whole kind of architectural considerations you were just talking about. But what it results in is if there's like major Flutter version upgrades, that's all happening essentially on the Dart side. So our upgrades are very seamless and we don't have to reconfigure any glue code or anything like that.
Wouldn't that be nice, Robin?
But that's
Seems like
the
Flutter's better.
core architectural difference, right? Well, it's not better,
In all
but
the
like
ways.
In all the ways that
but
don't
like
have-
React Native, you guys are composing actual native views,
Yeah.
right? And so we're not doing that. We're essentially, I think the closest way to describe Flutter is if you took React Native Skia, right? And then had like the full force of Google, or at least one of their teams, building UI components so that you could build your UI in React Native Skia and actually have something that works fairly well. That would be like more architecturally similar to Flutter.
That is very similar. And if you're a web developer, it would be a lot like, instead of using HTML DOM elements, instead using a canvas and drawing on the canvas.
Yeah, you'd be like Ken Wheeler wielding the canvas.
Exactly. So It is a different approach. There are some benefits to doing that, and there are some drawbacks. Now, my sort of initial assumption was that
Actually, hang on, Jamon. How about you go through the benefits and I'll go through the drawbacks?
hey, I'm sensing a theme here. The benefits.
Yeah, there's a theme here for sure.
The benefits of drawing
Make
to
sure there's no bias.
the benefits of drawing to is what's essentially like a canvas or a 2D canvas is that you get essentially like buttery smooth animations. You get like Skia is famous for this. You've got really high frame rate stuff. You're controlling it completely. You can draw whatever you want. You can make any UI you want. You can also have a very consistent UI across any platform because you're not relying on platform primitives. You're just drawing. You're drawing to the canvas, and so you control exactly what that looks like. It's a blank white sheet of paper that you're drawing on.
Would you say that that you guys over in Flutter have fewer moments where you're like, okay, I built this and it works in iOS, and like you run it in Android and it's like broken, or like something's not rendering right? Do you feel like that happens less often because of this canvas idea?
Yeah, when you're talking about rendering UI, if it looks away on your iOS simulator, it'll look exactly like that on all platforms.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That is a guarantee of Flutter.
That's definitely a characteristic of React Native, of the like built it. Yeah. Oh, did you test it in Android? And then you maybe have to go back and tweak a couple things to make
and
sure
also
it works
web
everywhere.
Because Flutter Web for example uses
web is a whole
canvas.
That's canvas. Yep.
There are some downsides to that, but I'll let Luke talk about that.
Yeah, there are definitely some downsides. Okay, so the drawbacks, the first one that most people notice is text fields. So text fields is a native component, especially on iOS, that if you don't have access to that native component, somebody somewhere has to re-implement all of that in your like super fancy Canvas Dart UI thing, and they never get it right. So and people take text fields for granted. There's a lot of things going on in a text field, and they can be things like my phone has old settings on it, so my iPhone shows autocorrect in like little pop-ups like right over the text field. I get the sense now that people who have newer accounts, they're using newer settings, and they actually have these contextual things that pop up like connected to the keyboard as opposed to being connected to the text field. So if you've got the keyboard connected ones, then like you're fine. But if you've got the little bubbles that pop up over the text, like you're, you know what I'm talking about for autocorrect. Then on Flutter, like we don't have
those
because
you're not using the native text input. Yeah.
So that's not implemented. It literally does not exist in Flutter. So, but what we do have is, we've got the cut, copy, and paste. Like all those bubbles are there. We do have you hold down the space bar and you can like move the cursor around by dragging. But those have all been implemented by Google engineers to try to fit and look and act like what it is on iOS, and it's never in sync. So that's the first usability drawback that people run into with Flutter. Whereas on React Native, you get all of that for free because you're just using
UI text view.
UI text view. Yeah, exactly. So that's the first thing. Springboarding off that a little bit, there are little OS specific treatments. And what I mean by that is like OS version. So even within iOS, like iOS 13, 14, 15, 16, they can all have slightly different treatments on certain kinds of buttons and stuff like that. And so that doesn't get, updated with Flutter. We have what we call like a Cupertino library. And again, it's somebody went in and actually painted, like did their best to basically copy all of these UI elements, but they're kind of frozen in time unless somebody goes ahead and goes back and tries to keep updating those. And there's not usually like a lot of, after it's implemented, people don't really go back and like try to brush them up. So you don't get all that stuff for free, which you notice, I think, most on the iOS platform.
Yeah. And are you really relying then on the full force of Google to just keep things updated? Or is there any kind of community or open source like leverage there, or are you just like at the mercy of Google when they decide to update things?
So the answer is if you've got a fully custom UI, then you're completely decoupled from that, right? But if you are relying on like the iOS pickers or like certain iOS elements, like their spinner is actually a pretty good example. I can't remember which version it was, but the spinner changed in like one of the versions, and it basically just made all the Flutter apps look like they were frozen in time for people who were using that spinner. But then a lot of people were like, oh, well, we're just going to invest in like a branded spinner. Like, who cares, right? So there's like ways to get around it, and it's not the end of the world. But if there's like a certain trap that people fall into with Flutter where they're like, okay, we're going to ship Flutter, and it's going to like be compiled to native code, and it's going to have the native look and feel on both iOS and Android using these like platform aware widgets, but they're all kind of frozen in time. So it just continuously looks outdated. And so if you're in that scenario, that's like kind of a common trap. But if you have a fully custom UI, then you're pretty much in the clear.
Yeah. And I think that, coming back to React Native, that's one of the things that, like you said, you get a lot of this stuff for free. There's also accessibility concerns, although they've done a good job of making sure that, Flutter widgets are accessible and whatnot. And I think that's something that we should probably value a little more than we do, the fact that we're using the native platform primitives and getting all of that stuff for free. But it's a trade-off, because then, like Robin was saying,
things work differently.
They work differently across the platforms. You have to test very thoroughly in both. I'd say it's getting better. Like there's definitely fewer of those instances than there used to be. 3-4 years ago, whatever, you had to put a fair amount of time into making sure that it was usually Android, let's be honest. That was usually the culprit. Not always, but
so
usually.
I used to have this like mental model of the kind of challenges that iOS and Android would throw you, and like it was more likely going to be Android, but in general the Android ones were like quicker to fix. When you did have an issue with iOS, it was always like much harder and much more time to figure it out, because iOS tends to be much more opaque about things.
Much more.
And harder to sort of customize and have control. So it was like Android it was more off than it was Android, but it was usually easier to fix.
I wanted to touch on the accessibility thing really quickly, because that's something that comes up a lot. I would say that accessibility on web with Flutter is not good, but accessibility with mobile on Flutter is very good. And I think this has to do with platform tools. So I'll use mobile as an example, where you have all these video games, like Unity video games, which are kind of using the same architecture as Flutter, where you have like this 2D surface that you're painting on. And so iOS and Android gives us all kinds of tools to compose like an accessibility layer over something that's not native widgets. Now, when you compare that to web, the story is quite a bit different, because web heavily relies on the HTML DOM for all of its accessibility related stuff. And so when you get into these Canvas built apps, this is going to be the second time I've said Ken's name. I really wish I could ask him this question on stream, because he works with Canvas quite a bit. But it's not really clear to me that there's an easy story when it comes to accessibility with Canvas in the web. And so Flutter inherits that problem. But what's interesting is that because Google has both the Flutter team and the Chrome team, and Chrome team has a lot of weight over what happens with web APIs moving forward. They've worked together to craft a document to essentially try to push forward solving accessibility in web applications that are not using the HTML DOM. So too early to say what happens there, but it sounds like there's actual conversation there, and then maybe everybody will benefit from it.
This is why I think that having collisions between different platforms and different technologies and frameworks and whatnot is extremely healthy for the developer community. It's uncomfortable sometimes. Like, you get into a situation where you're in a discussion with someone who's sort of part of a different community, works in a different technology, maybe has different things that I would say priorities. I would say like these are things that are more important to them. I noticed this a lot with, I did native development in a technology that was actually probably more similar to Flutter than it was to React Native originally, Ruby Motion. And because it was compiled code and you could just use stuff just straight up. You didn't have to write glue code or anything like that. There's no bridge. Although it used native primitives and stuff, so it wasn't trying to draw to a canvas. Anyway, that was a collision between the Ruby community and the generally iOS native community, and there were some really cool things that came out of that. Like that was like people brought to that community, depending on their background, they brought different ideas and different things. Like why are we just putting up with this thing when over in this other technology it's so much better? And I think too often when we get in our own bubbles, like even just the native integration, like you're talking about the platform channels, Luke, with that's what they're called, right? In Flutter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, why is it not just that easy in React Native? It should be just that easy. It shouldn't be as hard as it is, but we just sort of kind of accept it, because that's how you've always done things. And at least it's not as bad as the old days before auto linking, and whatnot. But I feel like if you talk about React Native and specifically, what has really led to a lot of its success is the collision between the web community and native. So you have iOS and Android engineers, and then you have web engineers, and they all come in and they bring in different ideas. And generally speaking, the better ideas win. Not always, but generally speaking, they do, because people recognize, oh, that's way better. We should make that better. That sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, Luke, have that perspective.
Now, I heard recently that there was a change in styling in React Native, and someone could maybe tell me about this because I don't know much about it. But when I first tried React Native, I remember it was JavaScript object-based styling that was essentially Flexbox.
Yep.
And that was being essentially used on all platforms. And I thought that was an awesome way to handle styling, because it's like a very concise set of primitives that are easy for somebody to pick up and can be used in most scenarios. But I heard a rumor that something around that changed recently to act more like web APIs. Was I mistaken? Does anyone have information on this?
So the React Native styling system is based on something called Yoga. So it's not actually CSS Flexbox, but it's designed to mimic it. But it means that there's lag behind the real web Flexbox features. And so recently they've been trying to add features into Yoga so that it better has parity with the regular CSS Flexbox.
And there's some discussion about a replacement for Yoga, but I actually haven't heard much about that lately. It sounds like they're investing in Yoga again. And so it's actually pretty similar to probably when you used it, just a little more advanced. They've closed some of the gaps of things that are available in web.
No pun intended, because they literally added gap, row gap, and yeah.
Do you feel like the API is getting better with adding these features? Do you feel like it's getting worse?
I would definitely say, it's not detracting from it. It's only additive. Okay. It's not. Yeah. I haven't found it to be a hindrance at all or making it worse. Because
this is an idea that I find really interesting, where just recently, talking about getting out of our bubbles more, this is something that's been like a huge theme for me this year. I've earlier on in this podcast, I said how much I hated Python. I've been using Python pretty much every day now. I recently started using Swift UI. And one of the things that I really appreciated about Swift UI is that they have gone through and kind of rethought how to build front end using a very limited set of tools. And what they've come up with, I feel like, is a really, really, really good solution. And the API surface area is like, I don't know, 1/50th that tiny. Of Flutter. Yeah. And it's like amazing what you can build with it.
Yeah.
And so when I keep seeing, like, this is one thing that's really been important to me with just any kind of engineering, is this a lot of people want to just keep adding features and keep adding features and keep adding features, but you get to a point and it's like, okay, when you get to do the reduction, right? Like when you get to sit down and say, like, can we actually reduce this? And I feel like Swift UI has knocked that out of the park.
I agree. I use Swift UI in just a little test project I was doing, and it is pretty cool. Like there's no doubt about it. One of React Native's greatest strengths is also one of the things preventing it from going that way, and that is its like strong tie-in to React on the web side of things, which is really the whole point of the article that I wrote. It's like, do you have React? If not, then well, and ultimately, like it's a giant gorilla, because it drives so much of the conversation around in tech. It drives, it's just a huge, huge community. However, if React Native were to look at Swift UI and say, hey, we would like to go more that direction, we can't, because you would have to convince the whole React community, none of which use Swift UI. They're all a bunch of web developers. No offense, web developers, but you kind of have a bubble. And they wouldn't see it. They would totally be, they're looking outside. They've got, they're looking at other, solid JS and whatnot. That's their comparisons. And not trying to be too much old man yelling at cloud, but I feel like the web community really overcomplicates things sometimes compared to mobile. Mobile just feels so much more straightforward, and Swift UI is a great example of that.
Don't you feel like it's just kind of people reinventing the same thing over and over and over again, instead of just being like, all right, let's try to reduce this into like the final truth?
It's so true. I mean, I don't know. I could rant about this. It just feels, I guess I've been in the industry long enough. I started with PHP in 2004, there were a lot of ideas that were kind of becoming best practices and whatnot. We went through this whole evolution, and now we're over in the JavaScript node world and TypeScript and whatnot. And there are some really cool newer ideas that are coming through, but there are many things that people are like reinventing solutions. I just saw someone on Twitter, I won't name him, but just having looked into Laravel for like a bit, was like, wow, this is actually really good. And I'm like, yeah, look at Rails too. Back in the day, Rails, we had all this stuff too. One of the examples I like to use is recycling views in like a table view, where that's something that's kind of brand new with Flash List. But I mean, we had that a decade ago in iOS, like when we were doing development, just native development. But yeah, it is totally true. Stuff comes up over and over and over. I like to dabble in other technologies because you just get great ideas from it.
I think this is my plea to just framework engineers just across all ecosystems, which is, at one point you were a disruptor and you disrupted an incumbent, and then you became the incumbent. And unless you continue to disrupt yourself, then someone else will come over and disrupt you, and then you will no longer be the incumbent.
Yeah.
And so this idea that like we're just going to keep layering stuff on top of this like old crusty thing over and over and over and over and over again until somebody goes like, I'm done with this. Like, we got to do something about this. That's when you get disrupted. And so I don't want people to like sleep on their position.
Yeah. There are a lot of pressures though. There are a lot of pressures kind of keeping incumbents in that area, because you don't want to break things. I mean, well, yeah. We're getting to the end of our time here, Luke. I think that we could keep going for another 2 hours, but last question for you. What other options out there have caught your eye besides, React Native and Flutter? Have you tried Ionic, Kotlin multi-platform, NativeScript, anything like that?
So it's interesting. For me, the other option is actually pure native.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, I think cross-platforms are great. There is a reason for them to exist, but I've played around with Swift UI a little bit in the last couple of weeks, and I got to tell you, the actual velocity and quality you get out of Swift UI now compared to what you have to do previously with like Objective-C is just insane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's going to be a very compelling argument, and this is funny me saying this on your podcast, but I think there's gonna be a very compelling argument in the next couple of years that one Android engineer and one iOS engineer is going to be as fast as or faster than two React Native engineers or two Flutter engineers. And I think that that's a very new phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very bold take. I think it's a very new phenomenon because Compose is insane. Swift UI is insane.
But what's the Android? Is there an Android equivalent?
Yeah, it's Compose.
Yeah, that's Compose.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're both completely bonkers. The languages that they're using have incredibly ergonomic language features. They have so many problems solved right out of the box. And then the UI frameworks are very fast to build in, and they're so close to the platform. So I think that this is going to be a new conversation that people are going to start having in the next couple of years. And so that's what I'm looking forward to.
But you're saying cross-platform development like Flutter and React Native disrupted native development, and now native may be coming back to disrupt.
Yes,
React
absolutely.
Native
And I'm seeing it in Flutter because Swift UI essentially lifted a bunch of concepts from Flutter. Yeah. And I'm looking at what they did and I'm like, dude, we could have beaten them to the punch on like half of these things, right? But we were sleeping, right? and I'm seeing what they're doing. I'm like, this is insane. And so now I think that Flutter and React Native are going to be disrupted by the platforms that they disrupted.
I have a somewhat similar but slightly different path to get there, I think. I think that React Native and Flutter are fine for quite some time. And in fact, if you're starting a new project, that's still the way to go by far. But I do think that eventually, because I think that the idea of having a common code base is still a very, very powerful thing, like very powerful, because no matter what you do, that Android engineer and that iOS developer are not going to be at the same level. And you're going to end up with one platform lagging behind, and you're going to be annoyed by that. You're going to be annoyed by the fact that you can't launch this feature that's been done in iOS for weeks and you're still waiting on Android, or vice versa. But I don't think it's going to, I think it's going to be native, but it won't be written by humans. I think that it's going to be AI. I think it's going to be an AI description of what we want, and then AI will write it in native code. And so we'll have a common language, which is natural language, that, you know, Luke, you and I and Robin are all writing. And that language is describing the app that we want. And then what is generated is not React Native. It's not Flutter. It's going to be native code. That's my opinion about what's going to happen. But I think that's 5 years out, 3 to 5 years out.
So I think that's a good take, but I don't think we have to get that far in order for it to be disruptive. Because with GPT-4, what I've found is that I can jump into code bases and languages that I have never used before, and I can start being like alarmingly productive very quickly.
Yeah.
And so I think that this starts to break down this idea that, for example, the holy grail has always been JS on every part of the stack, whether you're running like a monolith or serverless architecture or on the edge. But now with GPT-4 being able to like spool up an engineer's brain in like a matter of an hour, I think that all of a sudden that, you know, the whole purpose of that was no context switching and no having to like relearn things. And I think that GPT-4, even the way that it is today, I think it breaks down about 80% of that, and like very quickly.
I agree with that for sure. I think the end game is what my prediction is, but I think that the middle game is what you're saying. And actually, Todd, my business partner, he was writing a script, and he is normally most comfortable in Ruby. So he was writing a Ruby. And he's like, wait, but Ruby's going to be slow for this. Ask GPT-4, rewrite this in Rust. It rewrote it in Rust. He made one little tweak and shipped it.
I know.
He just gave it the Ruby script, and that was it. Like, he didn't have to know Rust.
The amount that GPT has changed my entire like day-to-day life as a developer is...
I think we just pivoted into a different podcast.
We
somehow,
did.
But,
it's a podcast that we already made, but...
yeah, but I love
Well,
this.
I'm sure we'll
Luke,
probably make more because it's like evolving so quickly.
yeah, it's not over yet. Luke, thanks so much for coming on. We have way more to talk about, but I need to cut this short, or the editors will
Riot.
come looking for me.
That sounds good. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on, and it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Where can people find you online?
So I post mostly on Twitter, and that's going to be at Luke_Pighetti.
Perfect. And you're also on Twitch and YouTube as Luke Pighetti.
I don't do Twitch anymore, but I do YouTube every now and then. Yeah. So I stopped doing Twitch just because I was putting a lot of hours in, and I wasn't getting a lot of love back from the Twitch algorithm.
Then
So
that's
I
just
decided
not
to
worth
switch
it.
to
That's
YouTube.
not worth it.
I know what that's like.
And YouTube has been very good to me.
Oh, that's nice.
That's good. You can find Robin at Robin_Heinz. You can find me at Jamon Holmgren, and React Native Radio at React Native RDIO. As always, thanks to our producer and editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor and episode release coordinator, Jed Bartosky, our designer, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Derek Greenberg. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/React Native. Make sure you subscribe. Send this episode to someone who might find it interesting. Robin, do you have a mom joke today
I do.
to take us out?
I do. This is courtesy of Nick Morgan, who is our newest Infinite Red employee.
Hey, Nick.
Hey, Nick. So his contribution is, I just found out I'm colorblind. The news came out of the purple.
Thanks a lot. We'll see y'all next time.
Womp womp.